Imagine the harvest fails. Your pantry is empty, and every single meal becomes a gamble. In medieval times, whole communities survived on foods we'd call unthinkable today. Tree bark, fermented gruels, wild roots, even rodents. What did people actually eat during famines, and what survival lessons can we learn from them? Stay with me. Welcome to Decoding History and Science. Today, we re-uncovering a forgotten chapter of human survival, the secrets of nutrition during famine in the medieval world. Most of us can't imagine life without full plates and stocked grocery stores. But back then, scarcity wasn't the exception. It was the rule. Entire villages faced years without proper harvests, and yet people survived. Not on feasts, but on ingenious substitutes, desperate measures, and foods that tested the very limits of human endurance. In this video, we're going to journey through that harsh reality. You'll discover what medieval people ate when there was nothing to eat, how they adapted their diets, and why their survival strategies still fascinate scientists and historians today. And here's the real reason to stick around. By the end, you'll see how these forgotten foods shaped medieval society, culture, and even future cuisines in ways we rarely think about. So, let us step into the shoes of those who lived and struggled in an age of hunger. Chapter 1. The Harsh Reality of Medieval Famines. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. You live in a small medieval village, surrounded by farmlands that usually provide bread, vegetables, and maybe a little meat during feast days. But this year, the rains haven't stopped. The fields are waterlogged, the grain has rotted, and the harvest has failed. Now imagine it's not just one bad year, but two in a row. That's exactly what happened during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 in Europe. Entire regions faced food shortages so severe that millions starved. Chroniclers of the time wrote chilling accounts of villages abandoned, livestock dying in the fields, and desperate families roaming the countryside in search of scraps. This wasn't just about hunger. It was about survival in a world without grocery stores, without food aid, and without modern preservation techniques. When crops failed, there was no backup plan. In fact, medieval Europe had a saying, "Bread is life." Bread wasn't a side dish. It was the core of every meal. But when harvests collapsed, that life disappeared. Grain prices skyrocketed, sometimes doubling or tripling within weeks. A loaf of bread that had been affordable for a poor family suddenly cost more than they earned in a day. Now here's where things get even more shocking. Famine didn't only strike the poor. Even nobles and monasteries, with their storerooms and estates, felt the pinch. Their tables grew smaller, meat grew scarcer, and even they sometimes had to turn to unusual substitutes. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Famine didn't just kill people with starvation. It weakened bodies, made them vulnerable to diseases, and created social breakdown. Malnutrition turned small illnesses into deadly epidemics. Riots erupted in cities as hungry crowds stormed granaries and bakeries. Families were torn apart as parents abandoned children or sold themselves into servitude for a piece of bread. Let me ask you, how do you think you would survive in such a world? Would you rely on the mercy of neighbors, try to hunt, or risk eating something you'd normally consider inedible? Because here's the reality. Famine tested not only people's strength, but also their morals. Chronicles tell us that theft, violence, and desperate bargains became common. Hunger changed people. It stripped away normal rules of society and replaced them with one brutal question: how do I make it to tomorrow? And that's why what came next is so fascinating. When bread, the foundation of medieval life, was no longer available, people turned to shocking substitutes. From tree bark to weeds, famine forced them to reinvent what food even meant. So, let's move deeper into this story and uncover the dark tale of bread of desperation. The strange loaves that people ate just to survive. Chapter 2. Bread of Desperation. In the medieval world, bread wasn't just food, it was survival. Every class of society, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest noble, depended on bread as the backbone of their diet. A typical peasant might eat 2 to 3 pounds of bread per day, washed down with weak ale or broth. Without bread, meals simply didn't feel complete. But in times of famine, this foundation crumbled. Wheat, the most prized grain for making soft white bread, became a luxury only the wealthy could afford. For ordinary villagers, the reality was much harsher. Instead of wheat, peasants turned to rye, oats, barley, and whatever grain could be scraped together from the fields. These grains made darker, heavier bread filling, yes, but often coarse and difficult to digest. Still, when hunger gnawed at the stomach, it was better than nothing. And here's where the story takes a grim turn. As famine deepened, even rye and barley became scarce. That's when people began to create what historians call famine bread. Imagine a loaf that looks like bread but contains almost no real grain. Instead, families stretched their dough with anything they could grind into powder: acorns, chestnuts, pea flour, ferns, weeds, and sometimes even ground-up tree bark. At first glance, this might sound resourceful, a clever way to survive, but famine bread often came with a deadly cost. Many of these substitutes contain toxins or substances that damage the body when eaten in large amounts. Acorns, for example, contain tannins that can be poisonous unless carefully leached out with water. Bark bread was so low in nutrients that it left people weak, malnourished, and prone to disease. Doctors of the time recorded chilling accounts of famine bread causing stomach pain, paralysis, and even death. In one 15th century chronicle from Scandinavia, villagers were described baking bread with ground-up tree roots mixed with moss. The bread filled their bellies, but brought on what was called famine sickness, a wasting illness that slowly killed. Now pause for a moment and imagine sitting at a wooden table in a candlelit cottage. Your family is hungry. The last of your grain is gone. You scrape together a handful of acorns, crush them with a stone, and mix them into a sticky dough with weeds pulled from the roadside. You bake it over the fire. The smell is bitter. The taste is worse. But your children are staring at you with empty eyes, and you break the loaf anyway. Would you eat it, knowing it might make you sick, or go hungry and risk starvation? These are the impossible choices that medieval families faced. And yet, famine bread wasn't always just desperation. Over time, some communities developed techniques to make these loaves safer. Acorns could be boiled or soaked to remove tannins. Chestnuts could be roasted and ground into flour that was actually sweet and nutritious. In fact, in regions like Corsica and parts of Italy, chestnut bread became so common that it later turned into a beloved local tradition. What once symbolized famine eventually became heritage. But during medieval famines, there was no romance to these loaves. For most, famine bread was bitter, dense, and heavy, food that reminded people of hardship. Some records even describe how people wept while baking it, mourning the absence of real grain. And here's something even more unsettling. Famine bread blurred the line between food and poison. While it kept people alive day by day, it weakened them in the long run. Malnutrition lowered immune systems, making entire villages vulnerable to outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and typhoid. Hunger didn't just starve bodies, it set the stage for epidemics. Think about it this way. Bread, the symbol of life, became the very thing that broke people down. A cruel irony of history. But this raises a deeper question. When bread itself could become a danger, what else did desperate people turn to? If fields failed and famine bread wasn't enough, where did medieval families look for their next meal? The answer takes us into the forests, where survival meant gambling with nature itself. And that is where our story leads next. To the risky world of foraging wild plants and roots, where a single mistake could mean life or death. Chapter 3. Wild Plants and Foraging for Survival. When famine stripped the fields, bare and even famine bread wasn't enough. Medieval people turned to the wilderness. Forests, meadows, and riverbanks became lifelines. What we today might call foraging, often celebrated in gourmet culture, was, for medieval peasants, a desperate gamble between nourishment and poison. Picture a group of villagers walking through the woods, baskets in hand, searching not for delicacies, but for anything that could quiet the hunger. Children picked nettles and dandelions. Women dug up roots. Men hunted for mushrooms or gathered nuts. Every green shoot, every berry, every root became a potential meal. But in this silent search, one question lingered with every handful. Will this feed us or kill us? Let's start with the plants that became staples of survival. Nettles, for instance, were one of the most common famine foods. They sting when touched, but when boiled, they become edible and surprisingly nutritious, packed with iron and vitamins. Even today, nettle soup survives as a rustic dish in parts of Europe. Dandelion leaves, often dismissed as weeds, also provided essential minerals. Roots like burdock, wild onions, and parsnips became life-saving stews when cooked over the fire. Then there were berries, blackberries, raspberries, elderberries, gathered in large quantities during lean months. Nuts, such as hazelnuts and walnuts, when available, could be ground into pastes or eaten raw, providing much-needed calories. But here's the twist. Not all wild foods were safe. Many medieval families, lacking formal knowledge of botany, took deadly risks. Plants like hemlock, nightshade, and foxglove grew side by side with edible herbs. A wrong choice could mean paralysis, hallucinations, or death. Chronicles describe entire families falling ill after boiling herbs they believed were edible. Hunger blurred judgment, and desperation silenced caution. Mushrooms were an even greater gamble. Some varieties, like chanterelles and porcini, were edible treasures. Others, like the death cap, were lethal, and their effects weren't always immediate. Imagine eating a mushroom stew on a hungry stomach, only to discover hours later that you'd poisoned yourself and your family. In famine years, people rolled that dice because the alternative was worse: starvation. Now here's where this gets fascinating. Medieval survival wasn't just trial and error. Knowledge of wild plants was passed down through generations. Local healers, herbalists, and wise women often carried crucial knowledge of what could and could not be eaten. Their role became essential in times of famine, but this also created suspicion. In some cases, when people fell ill after eating foraged food, blame fell on these herbalists, fueling the stereotypes that later contributed to witch trials. But foraging wasn't only about plants. Roots like cattails, found near riverbanks, were dug up and ground into flour. Acorns, once again, made their appearance, leached, crushed, and baked into rough cakes. Even tree bark was scraped, dried, and ground into a flour-like powder. Birch bark, pine bark, and elm were among those sometimes used. Now pause for a moment and picture this: a family huddled near the forest edge. The mother boils nettles into a thin green broth. The father digs up roots, scraping mud from them with a knife. The children chew on bitter berries. The food is meager, the taste unpleasant, but in that moment, the forest becomes the difference between life and death. But this lifeline came with another cost: depletion. When whole villages turned to foraging, forests quickly became stripped of their edible plants. Areas once abundant with nuts or herbs were left barren. Hunger spread from one community to another, like ripples on a pond. Survival meant walking further and further, sometimes trespassing into neighboring lands. And trespassing could be dangerous. Lords and landowners often controlled rights to forests and rivers. Gathering wood, plants, or game without permission could lead to fines, or worse, physical punishment. Imagine being starving, yet risking imprisonment for picking mushrooms on the wrong land. And here's where famine became not just a natural disaster, but a social one. The poorest suffered most because they lacked access to safe lands or knowledge of plants. The wealthy, meanwhile, could turn to stored food, trade networks, or imported goods. Hunger created not only pain, but also resentment. Now, let us bring in a surprising fact. Some wild famine foods eventually became part of regular diets. Nettle soup, mushroom stews, and wild herb salads later entered medieval cookbooks as seasonal dishes. What began as survival meals were later remembered as traditional recipes. Survival shaped culture in ways people didn't realize at the time. But despite these small victories, the risks of foraging never went away. Think about this. Hunger doesn't wait. When your stomach growls and your children cry, how carefully can you test each plant? Would you risk a berry that looks safe, even if you're not sure? In the heat of famine, hesitation often vanished. This is what made the wilderness both a savior and a killer. For every family that survived on nettle broth, another might have fallen to poisonous herbs or spoiled mushrooms. The forest was a gamble, and famine forced people to play. And yet, as dangerous as foraging could be, people did it because they had no choice. But when plants, nuts, and berries weren't enough, medieval families turned to something even more controversial: meat, fish, and the unthinkable. Because when hunger grew unbearable, people began eating things they would never have considered food in normal times. And that's where our journey takes us next. Chapter 4: Meat, Fish, and the Unthinkable Throughout Medieval Europe. Meat was never an everyday food for the common person. In fact, even in times of abundance, peasants ate very little meat. A festival day, a wedding, or a religious feast might bring pork, beef, or poultry to the table. But for most, bread and porridge were daily staples. Meat was a luxury, not a guarantee. But famine turned that luxury into a dream. When fields failed and bread grew scarce, families searched desperately for other sources of calories. Naturally, their eyes turned to the rivers, the woods, and the animals around them. Fishing became one of the first survival strategies. Rivers, lakes, and even muddy ponds were scoured for fish. Carp, trout, and perch became valuable catches. In coastal areas, shellfish and seaweed were gathered in bulk. Some medieval records mention villagers boiling snails, limpets, and even jellyfish during shortages. Though these foods lacked the prestige of farmed meat, they offered vital protein when nothing else remained. But hunger doesn't discriminate. When fish weren't enough, people turned to small animals. Rabbits, squirrels, hedgehogs, and wild birds became survival food. Even frogs and toads were eaten, sometimes boiled into stews flavored with whatever herbs could be found. And here's where famine pushed boundaries. When truly desperate, families ate animals considered unthinkable in normal times. Cats, dogs, rats, and even carrion birds like crows or ravens ended up in the pot. Chronicles from the Great Famine of 1315-1317 describe how starving villagers scoured their own towns, trapping vermin to roast over weak fires. The same hands that once shooed rats away from grain now caught them for dinner. Imagine the scene. A family crouched in a dark cottage, roasting a rat on a stick, the smell acrid, but the hunger unbearable. Children's faces pressed close, waiting for a scrap of meat. It is haunting, but it was reality. Now, think about this. Hunger changes not only what people eat, but how they think. What was once disgusting becomes acceptable when your stomach has been empty for days. Anthropologists call this survival adaptation, and famine is one of the clearest examples in history. But the story grows even darker. In some chronicles, we read about villagers boiling animal hides, old shoes, scraps of leather, harnesses, anything made of animal skin. Boiled long enough, leather softened into a kind of chewy stew. It wasn't nourishing, but it was something to chew on, something to fill the silence of hunger. Bones, too, were ground into powders and boiled into soups. In some places, People scavenged bones from the refuse heaps of butchers, trying to draw out any last drop of fat or marrow. These were not meals in the joyful sense, but desperate attempts to survive another day. And yet, the desperation didn't stop there. Hunger sometimes pushed entire communities into practices that horrify us today. Rumors of cannibalism appear in certain medieval sources. Parents abandoning children, strangers vanishing in famine-stricken regions. While it is hard to know how widespread such acts were, the fact that they appear in chronicles at all shows the depths of fear famine inspired. But let's not stay in the darkest corners just yet. There were also moments of resilience. People learned to preserve fish with salt, to dry meats when they had them, and to share catches with neighbors in order to keep small communities alive. Collective hunting parties brought down deer or wild boar, though these hunts often risked punishment, since forests were strictly controlled by nobles. To take a deer without permission was not only theft, but a serious crime. Yet, when hunger gnawed, laws lost their weight. And here's the tension. Meat, fish, and these desperate foods were not just about survival. They also revealed the deep inequalities of medieval society. Nobles and clergy, with access to estates, could still dine on salted pork, dried hams, and casks of fish during famine years. The poor, meanwhile, chewed on boiled hides or fought over rats. Hunger wasn't shared equally. It was divided by class. Pause here and ask yourself, if you were a peasant in the 14th century, and you saw your lord's table still full while your own family starved, what would you feel? Resentment? Rage? Perhaps even rebellion? These emotions were not abstract. They fueled real uprisings in medieval Europe. Famine didn't just empty bellies. It ignited political unrest. But let's return to the core question. In times when meat and fish became rare and even leather was boiled into stew, how did communities stretch these meager supplies? The answer lies in a strange world of ersatz foods, substitutions so unusual that they blur the line between ingenuity and madness. And this leads us into our next chapter, the story of strange grains, roots, and substitutes that people transformed into food when even animals could no longer sustain them. Chapter 5. Strange grains and ersatz foods. When famine dragged on year after year, the forests could no longer provide enough roots and berries, and hunting grew dangerous or impossible. People had to push the very boundaries of what counted as food. This is where medieval ingenuity, or desperation, gave rise to what historians call ersatz foods, strange substitutes created to stretch meals beyond recognition. Let's begin with grains. Wheat and rye might vanish from markets, but people still needed bread to survive. In place of grain, families experimented with anything that could be ground into powder. Barley husks, oat chaff, and pea flour were mixed into rough loaves. Some villagers roasted chestnuts and crushed them into flour, producing a sweet, nutty bread that was surprisingly filling. In parts of southern Europe, chestnut bread eventually became so common that it lived on as a tradition long after the famine years ended. But not all substitutes were safe or pleasant. In northern Europe, records tell of famine bread made with ground-up ferns or even powdered straw. Imagine chewing on a loaf that tastes like damp grass, heavy and bitter, sitting like a stone in your stomach. People ate it because hunger left them no choice. Tree bark, once again, made its appearance. Stripped from pine or birch trees, dried and ground into powder. Bark was mixed into dough to bulk up loaves. Bark bread filled the belly, but it offered almost no nutrition. Some chroniclers describe entire villages weakened by bark bread, their bodies surviving, but their strength fading away. And then there were the more experimental foods. In certain regions, villagers boiled roots like lupins or beans that were normally used for animal fodder. They crushed seeds from wild grasses, roasted them, and ground them into makeshift meal. Even thistles and reeds were sometimes dried, pounded, and cooked into strange porridges. Pause for a moment and imagine this. A family huddled around a fire, stirring a pot of bubbling green mash made of weeds and roots. The smell is bitter, the taste nearly unbearable. Children grimace as they swallow. But they swallow anyway, because in famine, flavor doesn't matter. Survival does. Now here's something remarkable. Some of these famine substitutes paved the way for future culinary traditions. Chestnut flour, once a desperate choice, became a delicacy in Italy and France. Roasted roots, used as ersatz coffee during famine centuries before coffee reached Europe, remained part of local customs. What began in desperation sometimes lingered as heritage. But make no mistake, the majority of these substitutes were harmful. They lacked essential nutrients, leading to scurvy, rickets, and weakened immune systems. Prolonged dependence on ersatz foods turned villages into easy prey for epidemics. A loaf that kept you alive today could leave you too weak to fight disease tomorrow. And there's another side to this story. Psychology. Eating famine substitutes wasn't just physically hard, it was emotionally devastating. Bread, the symbol of life, had been transformed into a bitter, twisted shadow of itself. Chroniclers write of people crying as they baked loaves of bark bread, mourning the absence of true grain. Every bite reminded them of loss. Now think of this in modern terms. Imagine walking into a kitchen and finding no rice, no flour, no pasta, nothing recognizable. Instead, you grind up sawdust, weeds, and bitter nuts to feed your children. You know it won't give them strength, but it may keep them alive for one more day. Would you feel hope or despair? And yet, out of this despair, communities also found creativity. Monks in monasteries experimented with fermenting wild grains into thin, sour ales that carried enough calories to sustain weak bodies. Villagers mixed herbs into ersatz breads to improve taste. Some even created stews with strange combinations: weeds, dried beans, bark flour, and bits of salted fish, trying to make the inedible edible. But here's the cliffhanger. These substitutions weren't enough on their own. They filled bellies, but drained strength. They stretched food, but they stretched human endurance even thinner. People realized that no amount of ersatz bread could save them unless they came together. And that takes us to the next crucial part of our story: how medieval society tried to fight famine collectively. From charity kitchens to communal ovens, from church handouts to the riots that followed when food ran out. The struggle for survival wasn't just about strange foods. It was about the survival of communities themselves. Chapter 6. Communal Kitchens and Survival Strategies. When hunger grips not just one family, but an entire village, survival stops being a private battle. It becomes a collective struggle. Medieval communities discovered, sometimes willingly, sometimes through sheer necessity, that their best chance lay in coming together. At the heart of this response were communal kitchens. These weren't kitchens in the modern sense, but large ovens or hearths built in the center of towns or monasteries. Here, food could be cooked in bulk and distributed among the poor. In some regions, wealthy landowners or local lords financed these efforts, not always out of kindness, but often to prevent unrest. A hungry village, after all, could quickly turn into an angry one. Imagine this scene: smoke rising from a great stone oven, the air thick with the smell of thin porridge. Dozens of villagers, gaunt and weary, queue with clay bowls and wooden ladles in hand. Children cling to their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with hope. The meal may be little more than barley water or a broth of boiled weeds, but to those waiting, it is life itself. The Church played a central role in this survival network. Monasteries were among the few institutions with the resources to store grain, and monks often distributed bread to the poor. This was seen as both charity and duty, rooted in Christian teachings about feeding the hungry. Parish priests urged the wealthy to give alms, and collections were organized to fund communal food. But let's not imagine it as pure charity. For the elite, supporting communal kitchens was also a way of maintaining order. History tells us that when famine struck, desperation often boiled over into riots. If a grain merchant was caught hoarding supplies, angry crowds might storm his granary. In some towns, bakeries were looted when bread prices rose too high. Authorities knew that a loaf of bread could be the thin line between obedience and rebellion. There were also survival strategies beyond the kitchen. Villages sometimes pooled their labor to forage more effectively. Groups ventured into forests to gather acorns, chestnuts, or wild herbs, sharing the haul with neighbors. Fishing communities organized collective hunts, drawing nets together to maximize the catch. Even in famine, there was power in numbers, and yet inequality was everywhere. Not everyone benefited equally from communal survival. The wealthy often had access to better rations, while the poor were left with watery stews and bark bread. Monks might distribute bread, but only after ensuring their own monastery was well supplied. Chroniclers write bitterly of nobles feasting, while peasants starved outside their gates. This contrast sometimes exploded into violence. Food riots weren't simply chaotic. They followed a kind of grim logic. Villagers often targeted those they believed were withholding supplies. Millers, bakers, merchants. To them, famine wasn't just a natural disaster. It was worsened by human greed. Let's pause here and imagine yourself in that world. You're standing in a crowded square. The communal pot has run dry, and you know there will be no second serving. Your children are crying with hunger. Across the street, you see a merchant's storeroom piled high with sacks of grain. What do? Wait patiently or join the growing crowd pounding on his doors. It's this tension between cooperation and conflict that defined medieval survival. On one hand, the communal kitchen symbolized hope. People feeding one another, sustaining life in the bleakest times. On the other, it reminded everyone of injustice. Why should some eat well while others live on scraps? And yet, despite the inequality, the very existence of communal strategies is astonishing. These kitchens, ovens, and shared food distributions were early forms of what we might today call public welfare. They showed that even in the darkest days, medieval society understood something vital. No one survives famine alone. But here's the twist. Even communal survival had its limits. Thin porridge could stave off hunger for a day, but disease, malnutrition, and despair crept in with time. Communities might band together, but the famine could still outlast their strength. And when famines stretched into years, even the most generous kitchens ran dry. That's when people were forced to face the unthinkable, the breaking point of morality itself. What happens when hunger pushes society beyond food, beyond substitutes, beyond sharing? What happens when survival demands choices darker than bark, bread, or communal stews? That takes us into the most unsettling chapter of all. Famine, breaking point, cannibalism, and moral collapse. Chapter 7. Famine's breaking point. Cannibalism and moral collapse throughout history. Hunger has tested human limits. But during the great medieval famines, when every substitute had been tried, when bark bread had been eaten, when weeds and acorns had been boiled, and communal kitchens had nothing left to give, there came a point where desperation pushed people beyond morality. This is the breaking point. It's the place where the very definition of what it means to be human is questioned. And yes, in medieval Europe, there are haunting records of people turning to the unthinkable. Cannibalism. Now, before we go further, it's important to remember that these were not everyday practices. People did not simply wake up and decide to eat human flesh. These were rare, extreme, desperate acts, but their very existence tells us how horrific famine truly was. Chroniclers from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, one of the worst Europe ever faced, describe shocking scenes. Families so starved that they dug up freshly buried corpses. Parents who, in whispered accounts, were said to have killed and eaten their children. Whether some of these stories were exaggerated by moralistic scribes is debated by historians today. But even if a fraction of it is true, it shows how hunger could shatter the deepest bonds of society. Imagine the moral collapse this represented. In a world where faith and family were everything, famine tore even those sacred ties apart. The parent-child bond, the sanctity of burial. The laws of the church all could be broken by the gnawing emptiness of the stomach. We must also consider how these stories spread. Chroniclers often highlighted cannibalism not just as fact, but as warning. Proof of how far society could fall when God's wrath or nature's cruelty struck. Cannibalism became the ultimate symbol of famine's horror, the darkest mirror of human desperation. And here's a haunting question. Would you judge those people or pity them? Can any of us, living in a world of grocery stores and stocked refrigerators, truly imagine the agony that drove them to such acts. But the breaking point of famine wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Hunger gnawed at the mind as much as the body. The constant weakness, the endless emptiness, the hopelessness of waking up each day to nothing. This broke people's spirit. Villagers lost trust in one another. Families fractured. Some gave up entirely, lying down to die rather than face another day of suffering. Society itself began to crack. Law enforcement weakened, theft and banditry soared, and violence became commonplace. In towns, rumors of cannibalism fed fear and paranoia. Outsiders were often blamed. Strangers traveling through a region could be accused of sorcery, witchcraft, or even of eating the dead. Hunger created not only victims, but scapegoats. And here's something even more disturbing. Famine often reshaped moral rules long after it ended. Survivors carried shame and trauma. Entire villages remembered who had stolen, who had hoarded, and who had crossed lines too terrible to forgive. For some, famine left scars deeper than any war. Let's stop here and imagine yourself in that moment. Your children are crying from hunger. Your neighbors have nothing left to share. The land around you is barren. Days pass, then weeks, and your body feels weaker with each step. What would you be willing to do to survive? Would you cling to your morals, or would desperation rewrite the rules? This is what makes famine so terrifying. It wasn't just about empty stomachs. It was about the collapse of everything that held society together. Food is life, but when food is gone, life itself becomes fragile, and morality begins to fade. Cannibalism was the darkest edge of famine. But even those who never went that far faced choices that scarred them forever. Theft, betrayal, violence, abandonment. All of these were born out of hunger. The famine wasn't just killing bodies, it was reshaping souls. And yet, even at the breaking point, humanity wasn't entirely lost. In some places, small acts of kindness still shone. A villager sharing their last crust of bread, a priest giving away the monastery's final sack of grain, a mother refusing to eat so her child might live one more day. These were rare sparks of light in a world of shadows. But when famine finally loosened its grip, when the rains ended, when the harvests returned, survivors were left to pick up the pieces. For some, life eventually went back to normal. For others, the trauma lingered forever, a memory of the day when society itself seemed to dissolve. The breaking point of famine teaches us something profound about human nature. It shows how thin the line is between order and chaos, morality and desperation. And it leaves us with a chilling reminder. Hunger doesn't just empty the stomach, it can hollow out civilization itself. But famine wasn't only about collapse. Out of the darkness also came resilience. New farming methods, new social structures, and lessons in survival that shaped the centuries that followed. From despair, people found innovation. From trauma, they found new strength. And that takes us into our next chapter. How medieval communities began to rebuild, and what survival really looked like once the famine ended. Chapter 8. Rebuilding after famine. Lessons learned when famine finally ended. When the rain subsided, or the drought broke, or when the long winters finally loosened their icy grip, people did not simply return to normal life. There was no switch that could erase the trauma. Instead, survivors had to rebuild their villages, their bodies, and their very sense of trust in the world. So what did recovery look like in the medieval era? First, the land itself had to heal. Crops had been ruined for 1, 2, sometimes 3 seasons in a row. Soil was exhausted, livestock herds were decimated, and seed stores had been consumed during the worst of the hunger. Fields that once rippled with golden wheat often lay empty, abandoned, or overgrown. Farmers faced the agonizing decision: replant with what little seed they had left, or risk starvation again if the weather betrayed them. Recovery was not immediate. Even when a good harvest came, it could take years to rebuild enough surplus to withstand future shortages. Villages that had once been bustling with life sometimes returned as hollow shells. Some families never came back at all, wiped out entirely by starvation and disease. But here's where resilience enters the story. Human beings, even at their weakest, find ways to adapt. After the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, some communities began diversifying crops. Instead of relying solely on wheat or rye, they added barley, oats, peas, or beans to their fields. This was more than just variety. It was insurance. If one crop failed, another might survive. Villages also developed stronger grain storage practices. The lesson was clear. Hoarding wasn't just about greed. It was about survival. Large barns, sealed pits, and even primitive granaries became essential for storing surplus from good years. Lords and monasteries invested in larger storehouses, knowing famine could return at any time. But recovery wasn't only material, it was social. Famine had tested relationships between peasants and lords, between rich and poor, between church and community. After the famine, these relationships were renegotiated. In some areas, lords who had been generous during the famine earned long-lasting loyalty. In others, those who had hoarded food or raised rents faced resentment that simmered for generations. The church, too, played a vital role in rebuilding. Clergy preached sermons framing famine as divine punishment, but they also organized prayers of thanksgiving when harvests returned. Pilgrimages were made to shrines, and processions wound through villages to bless the fields. Religious rituals became a way of processing trauma, of giving meaning to suffering that otherwise felt unbearable. Yet famine left scars that couldn't be erased with rituals. Survivors carried the memory of hunger in their bones. Chronic malnutrition stunted growth. Children born during famines were often smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable to illness throughout their lives. Entire generations bore the physical marks of famine, a reminder written on the body itself. Psychologically, too, famine left deep wounds. The fear of hunger never disappeared. In fact, historians believe that medieval communities often became hyper-aware of food security. Families were quicker to store, quicker to ration, and quicker to panic at the first sign of poor harvest. In some regions, this fear translated into folklore. Stories of famine, starvation, and desperate survival passed down through generations as warnings. And here's something remarkable. Famine also sparked innovation. After the horrors of mass starvation, rulers began to pay closer attention to food supply. Some medieval towns developed grain reserves controlled by local councils, which could be released during bad harvests. Trade routes expanded as communities realized the importance of bringing in grain from elsewhere. Slowly, painfully, medieval society began learning that survival depended not just on the weather, but on planning and cooperation. But perhaps the most important lesson famine left behind was this: no one could endure it alone. Communal strategies, however flawed, became a foundation for recovery. People remembered who had shared their last crust of bread, who had opened their doors, who had stood with them when everything seemed lost. In this way, famine didn't only destroy, also revealed hidden bonds of solidarity. Let me ask you to imagine this moment. You re-standing in the fields after the famine, watching the first shoots of green wheat emerge from the soil. The village is quieter now, many homes empty, but the sound of children laughing returns. The oven in the square is smoking again, this time not with bark bread, but with real loaves. There's still fear. There always will be, but there's also hope. And maybe, just maybe, you believe that the worst is behind you. Of course, famine always lurked in the background of medieval life. Another bad harvest could send the community back into hunger. But each time, survivors carried forward the lessons of resilience. Store more grain, diversify crops, work together, pray harder, hope stronger. And in this cycle of suffering and survival, we see the resilience of humanity at its core. Yes, famine broke bodies, fractured families, and tested morals. But it also forced people to adapt, to innovate, and to cling to life even in the harshest of times. And this leads us to the final question. What can we learn from their suffering today? In an age of abundance, supermarkets, and global trade, are we truly safe from famine? Or do the lessons of medieval hunger still echo in our modern world? Chapter 9. Modern Reflections. What medieval famines teach us today after journeying through the brutal reality of medieval famines? The bark bread, the desperate foraging, the communal kitchens, and even the unthinkable breaking points. We are left with one final question. What do these ancient struggles mean for us today? At first glance, our world feels worlds apart from the Middle Ages. We have supermarkets, refrigeration, airplanes that move food across continents in hours, and an entire global economy built on feeding billions. For many of us, famine feels like a nightmare from the distant past. And yet, hunger has never truly vanished. Even in our modern age, food insecurity affects millions worldwide. Natural disasters, climate change, political conflict, and economic inequality still push entire regions toward hunger, while the medieval villager relied on the weather and the mercy of their lord. Today's vulnerable populations often rely on fragile supply chains and international aid. The faces of hunger may have changed, but the struggle remains. So what lessons can we take from medieval famine survival? First, never take abundance for granted. Medieval people lived one harvest away from disaster. Today, we may feel secure, but disruptions, whether droughts, floods, wars, or even global pandemics, remind us that food security is never absolute. Second, community is survival. In medieval times, the difference between life and death often came down to whether neighbors shared, whether lords distributed grain, whether communal ovens stayed lit. In our world, too, crises revealed the same truth. No one survives alone. From food banks to humanitarian aid networks, survival still depends on collective action. Third, adaptation is key. Medieval people learned to diversify crops, store grain, and expand trade. We, too, face the challenge of adapting, not to medieval rains or frosts, but to modern climate shifts, resource pressures, and global inequality. Their resilience reminds us that innovation often comes from hardship. And finally, hunger tests humanity. It tested medieval families, sometimes shattering morals, sometimes inspiring kindness. It still tests us today. How we respond to hunger, whether with indifference or compassion, defines not just our survival, but our values as a civilization. Think of it this way. Medieval famines are not just stories of suffering. They are mirrors, showing us how fragile societies can be when food disappears, but also how strong people can become when they refuse to give up. So, the next time you sit down to a meal, remember those who lived through centuries of hunger with nothing but determination, faith, and resilience. Their lessons are warnings, but they are also sources of hope. Because if they could survive famine with nothing but bark, bread, and courage, surely we can face the challenges of our time with the resources we have today. At the start of this journey, we asked, what did medieval people eat during famine? And how did they survive when food itself seemed to vanish? Now we know the answer. They ate bark, weeds, acorns, and roots. They baked bread of desperation. They relied on communal kitchens, foraged the forests, and sometimes crossed lines too dark to speak of. But above all, they survived. Not because life was easy, but because they adapted, endured, and held on to hope. That is the true secret of nutrition during famine. Food wasn't just fuel. It was survival, community, and resilience. And those lessons remain just as powerful today. If you found this journey into history eye-opening, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What struck you most about how medieval people endured famine? Drop a comment below. Let's start a conversation. And if you enjoy exploring the hidden stories of history and science, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep uncovering the past and connecting it to the challenges of today. Give this video a like if it sparked your curiosity, and share it with someone who'd find these forgotten lessons inspiring. Together, we can keep history alive and keep learning from it.